Hi, my name is Lisa Spencer, and I'll be presenting my case study, Cocoa's Bittersweet Supply Chain. I designed this case study to be used in my production and operations management class as we study supply chain issues and ethics in the supply chain. A number of problems exist in the West African supply chain for cocoa. These problems include child labor, deforestation, poorly executed certification programs, and supply chain traceability problems. This case study addresses these issues and also talks about some of the potential ways that these issues can be improved or resolved in the future. By way of introduction, I'd like to share a quote with you from an Ivorian government official. He said, "It doesn't make sense to ask an Ivorian what cocoa means to him. It means everything. It's his first source of income. My education was funded by cocoa. Our houses are built with cocoa. The foundations of our roads, our schools, our hospitals is cocoa. Our government runs on cocoa. All our policy focuses on sustaining cocoa." To give a brief industry overview, the annual global chocolate industry sales are over $107 billion. And worldwide, about 4.85 million tons of cocoa was processed for the 2018-2019 growing season, which ended last October. And this was actually the largest crop on record since 1960. The price per metric ton at the beginning of 2020 was $2,500, which is sort of mid-range. In recent years, it's been anywhere from $1,800 to $3,250 a metric ton. Some of the major chocolate companies in the world include Nestle, Mars, Hershey, Mondelez, and Godiva. And each of these companies has, in its own way, tried to do things to improve sustainability in the cocoa supply chain. Nevertheless, we'll see that many challenges exist as they try to make improvements. And about 60% of the world's cocoa comes from West Africa. Specifically, most of it comes from Ivory Coast, and then secondarily also from Ghana. And this case study focuses on the West African cocoa supply chain with a particular emphasis on those two areas. To give some basic background on the cocoa supply chain, in West Africa, there are about 2 million farmers who, alongside their families, grow cocoa trees in fields, and then they dry the beans after they're harvested. Once the beans are dry, they're measured out into jute sacks, and they're sent to cocoa processing facilities in the United States and Europe. Individual farmers sell cocoa beans in 140-pound sacks to local middlemen who then aggregate or group together the beans from surrounding communities. And the price that's paid to the farmers is set by the government. The middlemen then take the beans to the government, which makes them available to cocoa processors for purchase. The processors convert the beans into cocoa powder or cocoa butter to be used in many food products. And chocolate companies like Hershey and Mars then buy the cocoa products for use in their candies. The life of West African cocoa farmers is very difficult. Poverty really is a root problem of many of the day-to-day struggles for the West African farmers. And for a variety of reasons, some of them are even worse off now than they were back in the 70s and 80s. Endemic issues cause stubborn problems in the supply chain that are difficult for chocolate companies to solve even when large amounts of money are spent. Sources such as World Bank and Fairtrade, which is a cocoa certification entity, report that the small West African farmer's cocoa income is somewhere around $1,900 to $2,000 a year. To describe it another way, a World Bank report found that 80% of cocoa farmers in West Africa are living on less than $3 a day. Sometimes they may have a bit more income coming in from other sources, such as farming other types of crops, or maybe earning a little bit more from the cocoa itself if they're being paid a premium. Nevertheless, the living standard is extremely low. So even though cocoa prices move up and down in world markets, the daily living expenses for farmers seem to only increase, as does the cost of running their farms. Chemicals, equipment, and labor make up their biggest expenses. Most of these West African farms are small, ranging somewhere between 5 to 12 acres, and they lack modern farm equipment and practices. Some of the farmers are sharecroppers, keeping about a third of the crop's value and turning the rest over to landlords. In rural areas, many residents lack electricity, and some villages don't even have a water pump or safe sanitation practices. UNESCO cites the Ivorian literacy rate at around 44%. Living in such extreme poverty makes it very hard for parents to pay school fees for their children, and instead, it often requires the work of the whole family to grow the cocoa. Two key problems and sustainability issues in the supply chain pertain to deforestation and child labor. Regarding deforestation, tropical forest land is required to grow cocoa, but farmers are not allowed to expand into new forest areas anymore. In the past, new farmland was carved out of the forest using a slash and burn approach. When the existing farmland grew infertile, new forested lands were cut down, burned, and planted with cocoa. New farmland was richer and less troubled by disease or pests. Thus, it yielded more cocoa at a lower cost. Whereas there were nearly 40 million acres of forest in Ivory Coast in 1960, by 2005, there were fewer than 5 million acres remaining. In Ivory Coast, as much as 500,000 tons of cocoa, equating to 18.5% of the country's total production, is still being farmed illegally in protected forest areas. On the other hand, for farmers who try to produce legally, no new land is available, so instead they have to rework their existing plots of land. This rework requires more labor, fertilizers, and pesticides, and therefore it's much more expensive than simply moving to new areas. In fact, it costs about twice as much now to replant as in the past, and the process can take up to 3 times as long as simply obtaining new land. Unfortunately, farmers cannot pass their increased costs along to the middlemen who buy their beans because the beans are sold at a fixed price. Because of this, farmers' living standards have decreased over recent decades. As farmers try to keep their tiny farms profitable throughout West Africa, they often turn to child labor. Thus, some of the deforestation solutions have spurred on the other and arguably greater problem, which is the use of child labor. Regarding child labor, it is endemic and it really has no easy solution. Child labor is what keeps the cocoa farms going. 2 million children are employed in West African cocoa farms, and that's a figure that many say has risen over the years, despite all the money and effort from the global chocolate industry and regional governments. Most of these children are working on their families' farms, helping make ends meet by providing much needed labor. However, the work they do is often dangerous, such as using machetes to cut down and split open the cocoa pods, spraying chemicals, or carrying 100-pound bags of cocoa beans. In addition, bosses traffic in other children from Burkina Faso, which lies to the north of Ivory Coast and Ghana. There may be as many as 16,000 of these children in Ivory Coast alone. An open border agreement between Ivory Coast and neighboring countries has resulted in as many as 1.3 million people coming across from Burkina Faso and 360,000 from Mali. And they're crossing over to a country, Ivory Coast, which, poor as it is, actually represents a hope of something better than the even more destitute situations in their homelands. While children of the farmers may forego some or all of their schooling to participate in the cocoa fields, for migrant children, the situation is far more grave. Living far from home, not attending school, and often not allowed to leave to see their families, they spend their days doing arduous work in the cocoa fields and their nights sleeping in huts in the woods. Some children say they have been threatened or even been physically harmed by the bosses. The parents of the trafficked children may initially be paid a few $100s to allow the bosses to take the children to neighboring countries to work in the cocoa fields. Sometimes the children themselves are enticed with money or other things like bicycles, which they often never actually receive. The bosses are paid around $9 a week per child employed by an Ivorian farmer. The child may see about half of that, meaning that he is working for less than $1 a day. And these children may be as young as 10 or 11 years old, but it's often difficult to even know because many of them lack documents regarding their date of birth. While it is illegal in Ivory Coast to employ these trafficked children, it's commonplace nonetheless. In July of 2019, the governments of Ivory Coast and Burkina Faso created new policies allowing Ivorian officials to return the children coming into the country unaccompanied to work on cocoa farms. So although Mars, Hershey, and Nestle promised to stop using child labor nearly 20 years ago, the problem persists, and there really are no simple solutions in sight. To provide for their families, most farmers need their children to help out with the cocoa chores, even if they do attend school during the day. Trafficked children may provide much of the remainder of the labor needed to keep many of the farms going. Various approaches have been taken to try to provide oversight to this supply chain. The Harkin-Engen Protocol was put into place in 2001. The US Congress was putting pressure on American chocolate companies to try to address issues of child labor and deforestation in their supply chains. In this agreement, chocolate companies pledged to self-regulate their practices and to eliminate child labor in their cocoa bean supply chain by 2005. Hershey and Nestle are among the most successful in this area, and now they are able to trace about half of their cocoa back to individual farms. But Mars trails with only about 24% traceable despite all its efforts. Even so, the deadlines set in the past to eliminate child labor have come and gone unmet. A goal set in 2010 was to reduce the use of child labor by 70% by 2020, but this objective will also not be met. The US Labor Department's most recent study in 2015 showed that there were 2.1 million children still working on cocoa farms as compared to 1.8 million in the 2009 survey. So the problem had actually gotten worse during that period of time. A second approach to supply chain oversight is third-party verification. American companies turn to several certification groups to help them determine and verify the origins of their cocoa. The American companies are trying to show that farms are not on nationally protected forests, that child labor is not being used, and that safe and sanitary programs exist for farm workers. And farmers who meet the standards set out by the certification agencies would be able to advertise that their cocoa is certified and would, to varying degrees, command a slightly higher price for their beans. Fairtrade, UTZ, and Rainforest Alliance are the three main certification agencies. Chocolate companies whose chocolate is certified by these groups can add that information on their labels to alert consumers to this practice. By the end of 2018, Mars reported that about half of its cocoa supply was certified. Hershey's was able to boast that 80% was, and Nestle had accomplished 46% globally and 80% among Ivory Coast farmers. However, overall, some people estimate that less than 25% of the cocoa produced in Ivory Coast can be traced to the farms from which it came, and most of it is sold by local aggregators in bulk shipments to cocoa buyers. So it's very difficult to actually know where it's coming from. There are challenges, even in the midst of this certification process, with a third-party verification. Corruption and auditing issues have made the value of UTZ certifications questionable. In addition to that, farms are spread across 100,000 square miles of territory, making it very hard to track and survey all that area. At best, auditors sample only about 10% of farms in any given group seeking certifications. So, for instance, a co-op may consist of 1,000 small farmers, but fewer than 100 of those would be inspected. Since inspections are generally announced in advance, farmers often just hide the child laborers until the inspectors are gone, and when they're interviewed, they deny that they have any child labor that is being used. In addition, some farmers bribe auditors or even issue death threats if certifications aren't provided. The poverty and illiteracy in these areas make it difficult to enforce ideals which are laudable and generally commonplace in Europe and the United States, but they're very difficult to realize in a developing country such as Africa. Farmers with limited reading skills may be required to follow a complex set of rules and guidelines in order to achieve and maintain the third-party certification. Despite all of these difficulties, there are some potential ways that the supply chain can be improved. One type of program is the sustainability initiatives by chocolate companies who have poured huge amounts of money into education and training for farmers to try to improve farming practices, health, and lifestyles. Another approach is that in one pilot program, local farmers are acting as liaisons to try to encourage children to return to school. And by having local farmers participating in that, it seems to be having a fairly positive effect. A third and really important approach is that farmers are diversifying into alternate crops like palm oil or rubber to bring in extra income. These crops can be grown without further encroachment onto protected forest land, and they typically don't require extra fertilizer or the costly labor required in the growing and harvesting of cocoa. Two other approaches that are being used include paying farmers more via COPEC, which is a recently begun cocoa cartel formed in Ivory Coast and Ghana to help ensure a decent income for farmers even if cocoa prices drop. Consumers can expect the price of candy bars, ice cream, and other products which use cocoa to increase as a result of premiums that will be paid under this COPEC system. And cocoa processors are already increasing their prices in front of the expected premiums. Cocoa processors will simply pass on their increased cost down the supply chain, resulting in these higher prices to the end purchaser. A fourth approach, which really seems promising and holds the potential to really change the way things are done, is payment digitization and traceability. To expand on that, until recently, Almost all transactions between farmers and licensed buying agents relied on cash, which was both a difficult and dangerous practice. Dangerous to both farmers and buying agents, and also difficult to trace. Both theft and fraud plague the system, and farmers and buying agents alike have been robbed or even killed for their cash. With digital payments, however, cocoa farmers are better able to safely receive funds, and they are also able to use such payments to obtain much needed inputs and planting materials from their own suppliers who often accept digital payments. Time is saved and productivity is improved when farmers don't have to travel to make purchases with cash, but can instead use their phones to pay digitally. Since most farmers lack any type of banking or credit history, what little credit they have received in the past has come from microfinance organizations or from their co-ops. Now, however, digital payments lay the groundwork for accessing other financial services like savings accounts, credit, or insurance. Farmers can also use digital payments for their everyday household purchases, since grocers, pharmacies, and other shops are increasingly accepting these forms of payment. To give an example of how this digitization process works, Cargill has recently digitized the so-called delegates, who are the members of the co-op that live in the farming communities and support the cooperative system. Their responsibilities include onboarding new members, collecting cocoa from farmers, overseeing delivery to the co-op, and ensuring that the farmers are paid. Each delegate is given a personal digital assistant that interfaces with other technology like digital weighing scales, barcoding systems, and biometric fingerprint sensors. Because of this, a farmer no longer needs to bring personal identification documents when he goes to sell his cocoa beans. When he goes to the warehouse to deliver cocoa, his fingerprint scan verifies his identity. From this, the delegate can see the size of his farm, the number of trees, and the average yield, along with the farmer's payment and credit history. After placing each bag of cocoa on the digital scale, the farmer receives a printed receipt and the data goes into the PDA. The delegate then tags the bag to link it with the farmer, who is paid once the quality of the beans is verified. The bags move on to Cargill, the processor, but each bag can be traced back to the individual farmer using this digital approach. In conclusion, while there are certainly no quick and easy solutions to the myriad problems in West Africa's cocoa supply chain, earnest efforts by the government, the cocoa industry, and farmers alike are helping to reshape the system and bring greater accountability and traceability in the future. Much remains to be done, but new technology, training, and awareness may hold the most promising hopes for improving sustainability in an industry that has long struggled to make meaningful change. Thank you.